And I'm glad now that we've got our next talk, Connecting Future, so the future backwards. And one of the important, again, a different kind of interaction, a different time, a different place, England, Mughal India and the origins of empire. So if I could invite Nandini and Roddy to come on stage. I see Nandini, I know Roddy's here, I've seen him. Oh, there he is. Thank you and welcome here. And an exciting discussion of Nandini's recent book, which has been causing waves. I think I've seen it reviewed just about everywhere. Rave review, a Financial Times book to read in 2023. But for me, perhaps, what really caught my attention was David Arnold, who was professor here, one of my former colleagues, saying what a great book this was in the TLS. A fascinating glimpse of the origins of the British Empire, drawn in dazzling technicolor, said the FT. Nandini Das is Professor of Early Modern Literature and Culture in the English faculty at the University of Oxford. And Roddy Matthews is a freelance writer specialising in South Asian history, who writes in many publications in India and in the UK, and has published several books. And I believe both books should be available at the bookshop. I hope so. I hope so. So welcome very much. You have till 1 o'clock when the important time of lunch arrives. And welcome. Looking forward to hearing from you both. Thank you.
Switch, are we on? Are we on?
I think so.
Yeah. Switch. Hello. Good morning, everybody. And welcome, thank you for coming, and hello on the internet if you're out there. Are we streaming? Yes. Great, well, hello everyone in the rest of the world. Just like to thank Nilüfer and Rahul for asking me back again. I've got an easy job today. This lady here is going to do all the work. But before we start, just get a little energy into the room. Are you ready for a discussion? Yes. Yes? Good. I'm going to do a little exercise. I say Khushwant, you say Singh. I say Khushwant, you say Khushwant. 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 There, we've all remembered what we're here for now, so that's good. And now over to Nandini Das. It's a very entertaining book you've written. It's full of detail and it's full of you've balanced the wider view of the whole of the sort of late Elizabethan Jacobean world and the world of Mughal India, with a close focus on Sir Thomas Roe, which is the central theme of your book, the embassy, the mission of Sir Thomas Roe to the Mughal court of Jahangir. So perhaps we could start with, can you tell us about Sir Thomas Roe and what he was trying to achieve?
I will do, Roddy, but I'm going to do that dreadful thing where I completely throw your plan out of the window, because there's something that I would very much like to say at the beginning. When I walked into this room, Ruth Padel was reading from the Emeralds, and it seemed wonderfully appropriate for me. I wrote Courting India over the lockdown. It's a book about the First English Embassy, as we have mentioned before. It's about a very early point in contact between England and India, and flawed contact in a sense, a period of uncertainties and misinterpreted nuances of cultural and diplomatic gestures. While I was writing the book, I was reading Ruth Padel's Emeralds, and one sentence there, one line there, the emerald as the only stone in which the flaws are prized, kept echoing in my head. There was a real reason, practical reason for it, and that was because I was writing a chapter where Thomas Roe, the first English ambassador, goes to India and goes through that terrible moment, perhaps all of us as guests in a different country or a different home, have faced, where you realize that the gifts you have brought are not appropriate. So he has that terrible moment, you know, when you walk into a birthday party and you think, oh God, what am I going to do? Except in his case, the stakes are higher. The party, the birthday celebrations are for the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. And he's just sat through a procession of 30 elephants bringing platters of gold and silver in front of him. So he's got high stakes to compete with. Rowe does not have enough suitable gifts. So he says he took from his own store a flawed white emerald because he knew that emeralds were prized in India. And this was an emerald that he had got etched with an image of Venus in the goldsmiths in London. And he put that in a curiously carved box and presented it to the emperor. Because he knew that the Mughal emperor would prize something that was a curiosity more than something that was perhaps merely of monetary value. So for me, that idea of the flawed emerald becoming a jewel, becoming a connection, resonated throughout that period of writing the book. And that's why this moment, when I walked in here and heard Ruth Padel reading exactly that same piece, it really struck a chord with me. But I apologize for veering away from your question.
No, it's marvellous. I would also like to say that Ruth Padel was talking about people escaping in boats from Smyrna. My godmother was one of those people. Her name's Arda Mandikyan, and she was an opera singer. Her father was Armenian, and her mother was Greek, and she escaped as a babe in arms in an open boat from Smyrna to Greece. So this sort of thing has been going on for a long time. And she was a great value to Greece when she got there. So just to say. Now, right back to her. Thank you, that was very enlightening. The Mughal court itself is a dazzling place, and you've given us some idea of that. And I've written about Thomas Rowe. You've written a great, long, entertaining book. I wrote 3 paragraphs. He was really struggling because, as you say, he came with the wrong things. England was not a poor country, but they didn't send him out with the kind of gifts that would impress the Mughal, the great Mughal, who was one of the richest, most powerful men in the world at that time. How did he get round it?
Well, partly the reason that
Did he?
Oh, well, that's a question, I suppose. Partly the reason he was so, as he would put it, poorly provisioned was largely to do with the way he had been employed. Split employment never works well. In Rowe's case, the English merchants had been trying for ages to get the state to do something, anything, about competing with the Portuguese and the Dutch and the various other European competitors who they saw getting an entry into the whole South Asian and Asian trade routes. This was not new for them. They had been struggling for about 15 odd years. The East India Company gets its license, you'll remember, Roddy, in 1600 or so.
Yes.
And by this point, where Rowe is commissioned, given the position as ambassador, we're talking about 1614. But one thing in the regime change between Elizabeth I and James I has stayed the same, and that is the state's extreme reluctance to invest any kind of hard cash in this initiative of global connections or encounters. And this is a problem for the London merchants, because this is a point where the merchants are increasingly aware that they are not only losing money because they don't have a suitable wider market for the one thing that England is really good at producing, which is English wool, and their European kind of markets have dried up for inevitable reasons. But they're also really keenly aware that elsewhere, their primary competitors, the Spanish, for instance, are investing huge amounts of money from the state. So when Rowe goes, he is essentially sent on the plea of the English merchants who say to James, look, we desperately need someone to go as a royal representative because otherwise the Mughal Empire is not going to give us the time of the day. They do not want to deal with mere merchants. So you need to send someone who's courtly, polished, good at all of those diplomatic kind of rituals, and also perhaps, able to do the social negotiation. And James agrees, but he's not paying Roe. It's East India Company who's paying Roe, which means poor Roe is stuck between these two employers with very little money to spend. And that's where the problem with the gifts comes in. Partly due to lack of knowledge, they assume to some extent that they can just about get away with sending, fairly good, but perhaps not over-the-top presents in some ways. The other thing that really plays against him is the weather. So, for instance, the showstopper gift that Roe is equipped with, in theory, would have worked very well. He was supposed to take a carriage. Now, carriages were terribly fashionable in England. They'd just been introduced about 8 years ago. At the end of Elizabeth I's life, she gets an Italian coachman and a carriage. And it's a great fashionable thing to roll through the streets of London. The governor of the East India Company, Sir Thomas Smythe, knows that carriages can be really good diplomatic gifts because when he was a governor to Russia, he had taken a carriage, and the Russians, who had constantly frowned on all English gifts till that point, actually liked this one thing. In fact, they liked it so much that it still survives in the Museum of Kremlin today. It was used for state occasions till about the early 20th century. So, yes, a carriage is a good idea. They pack one in. What they forget is that it's not going to go through the route that Thomas Smythe took to Russia. It's going to go around a very, very tricky, hot, humid sea route. So by the time Roe disembarks in Surat, you can imagine what had happened to the carriage. When he presents this carriage to Jahangir, Jahangir basically says thank you very politely, and then proceeds to get his artisans to remake the whole thing. He replaces all the nails with gold and silver nails. He replaces the faded, rotting velvet with Indian velvet. And he repaints the whole thing and then makes 2 more copies of it just to make his point clear.
That's an interesting point, which I, just for context for everyone else, and from a slightly wider view, that there are a great many misunderstandings about the East India Company, which have been promoted by some very well-known authors a bit later in the story. But one of the first misconceptions is that because it was called the East India Company, that it was set up to trade with India. It wasn't. It was set up to trade with the East Indies, which is defined as from the Cape of Good Hope to the Straits of Magellan. So it's a very, very large area, and they primarily went originally to get spices from Spice Islands, which is what the Dutch were doing. And the Portuguese had come back with pepper. They were trying to get those sorts of commodities. So actually having to deal with the Mughal and the Mughal Empire was not on their list of priorities at all. They wanted to go to the islanders, the simple islanders, and take nutmeg from them particularly. And of course what they had in return to give them was woolens. That's not going to work. So they ended up having to go to India first to get fabric to take to the Spice Islands. That worked. But of course now you've got the Indian unknowables in the situation. And some of those fabrics are also prized at home in England. They're very fine quality. So the idea of going to the Mughal was not the original idea. That's why it's 1614, after 14 years of trading.
Well, that's partly also because they lacked knowledge about what India meant. I mean, right till the mid-17th century, Samuel Purchas, who writes this big collection, edits this big collection of travel accounts, very clearly says, India, we know there's a geographical region, a nation called India, but by India here, I mean all those parts of the world that are distant from us. So it covers all. I mean, one inkling of the sheer lack of knowledge that we get, for instance, is when the first English ship goes to India, it carries with it a diplomatic letter from Elizabeth I to, and this is how it's addressed, to Zelapdim Ekebar, king of Surat. They mean, of course, the Mughal emperor Akbar, who is certainly not the king of Surat, even at this point. But partly the problem was also that the Portuguese, who had already been in India for about 100 years by this time, zealously guarded their own knowledge about the Indies. So for the English to go to India meant they were dealing with scraps of knowledge gathered from here and there. So in Rowe's, and this is something that really fascinated me when I was writing the book, and I really wanted to delve into, that for Rowe, what he was expecting, his horizon of expectations about India, so to say, was framed out of a mishmash, a kitchery, really, for those in the know, of multiple things, bits from classical Greek and Latin, and bits from the Dutch and the Portuguese, and bits of things he had seen on the English stage, for instance, all came together into this image of what the Indies might mean. And you're right, as part of it was also the spices, which initially triggered so much of that trade.
Yes, and the pepper market collapsed in the late 1620s, so that was one very large part of the original objective. Knocked out. The trade in spices was never very great with India. It became much more based around other things, particularly fabrics, quite early on. What then did Sir Thomas Rowe, can we get to the end of his mission? I mean, I have to say the book is delightfully written about the detail of all the endless problems that Rowe has with illness and court politics and this and that and the other, rotten presents and all of that. Getting a barrel of wine and finding it's off. And Jahangir opens a bottle of wine and he gives it back and says, "You better drink this quick before it gets any worse." I'm paraphrasing. He put it more gently than that. But what in the wider sense, can you tell us what Sir Thomas Rowe, if anything, achieved?
Well, Rowe went with a very clear mission. Again, with two very clear missions from his two employers. James I's instruction to him was to say, whatever you do, make sure that you impress on the Mughal emperor that I'm a great king and deeply loved by my subjects. So that was James's kind of directive. For the East India Company merchants, their kind of expectation from Rowe was that all-important trading firman or license. What they really wanted was an exclusive license to trade in India, as far as Europeans were concerned. That is not something that the Mughals were prepared to give. Now, partly, I think there's a perception that this was partly simply the Mughals' unwillingness to entertain the English. But I think one of the things that I argue in the book is that there is, once you look at it from the Mughal perspective, it's very clear what they're doing is a very deliberate playing off of three forces against each other, the three major European forces hovering on the maritime horizons of the empire, the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the English. So they were not by any means inclined to facilitate the kind of predominance of one of those European forces compared to any of the others. That was not going to happen. So Rowe, in some ways, has an embassy that is astoundingly unsuccessful and unfruitful. It couldn't have gone worse. He gets a trading firman, kind of trading license, but that is fairly limited in some ways. In fact, it is so bad, the results, that the English don't send another ambassador till about 80 years later. Mind you, they did have something else to keep them occupied in between the small matter of the English civil wars, the Wars of the Three Nations. So it's almost a century before the English go back and start revivifying this. And by then, as Roddy said, of course, the economic scenario had changed to some extent. The point where Rowe goes in 1614-15, Spices are still a major incentive. By the time William Norris, the second ambassador, goes, that market has taken a nosedive. So for Rowe, if you think about, well, did he succeed in his mission? The simple answer is no, he didn't. He failed miserably. I suppose then the big question is, why write an entire book about a failure?
I wasn't going to ask you that, but
you
now
were.
you
I
brought
really
it up.
admit it. You were. I think it goes back to what I was saying about the flaws in the emerald again. In a way, the failure is illuminating because it opens up an entirely different perspective on the relationship between England and India in this period. We're used to seeing that relationship from our post-colonial perspective with a specific power dynamics in place. Looking at it from that wrong end of the telescope at this point shows us transactions in a very different light. It shows us an empire that was very much not a given at all in this period. Rowe is constantly, in every other letter, he's wondering loudly and eloquently whether he should really pack up his stuff and get ready to go home. And so are the other merchants. So that uncertainty and fluidity is something that I really wanted to get to.
I think you did. One other thing to point out, which again in the slightly wider view, is that the Great Firman that they're looking to get, the exclusive trading licenses or whatever, is actually delivered in 1717. And there are 3 of them. But by then, actually, the Mughal emperor was not quite the force that they were. It was a man called Farrukhsiyar who didn't last very long on the throne. And Mughal power is still great, but it's not quite what it was under the first 6 great Mughals. Now, also by then, a number of other things have changed, which you just pointed out. In 1614, roughly speaking, India, meaning the South Asian area, and Europe were roughly technologically speaking, they were on roughly the same level. The Europeans had done ocean, had become maritime powers, and Indians were doing coastal navigation, which is why the Europeans went to India and the Indians didn't go to Europe. But by the time 1700 comes around, the difference in England between 1600 and 1700, or 1614 and 1717, is so enormous, because when James I sends an embassy, although they may have been technologically fairly similar, admittedly, India has the fine crafts, the jewellery and the fine craftsmanship, which was rarer to find in Europe. By the time we get to Farrukhsiyar, the English particularly had come through wars with France. They had national banking. There's the very strong capitalist base. So when the East India Company go to see Farrukhsiyar, the tipping has begun. The 17th century is absolutely crucial here, in that the supplicant, as Rowe goes, he is a supplicant to one of the most powerful men in the world. It's rather changed by 1717, and you can see a dynamic changing, but it took a century, which is why in my own book, which I will modestly mention in a minute, I always take the view that the British connection with India, the eventual British conquest of India, wasn't accidental, but it wasn't planned. It was incremental. And Rowe is I think you call it a false start, don't you?
I do.
You would agree with that?
I think also one of the kind of defining things of our current historical understanding is, as you're saying, that later period has had significant attention. That the earlier period that I'm interested in is interesting because it's not simply about the technological difference, it's also about differences about national and cultural needs, in a sense. So the fact that the Mughals did not venture through seafaring voyages into Europe is not simply because of a lack of technological expertise, it's simply because they didn't perceive a need for that. The trade and the luxury items they wanted were being brought to them. They had the resources to buy them. The problem with Europe was Europe's collective lack of silver.
Yes,
Silver which drove the lack of silver specie, or the metal itself, which drove European economy, was being supplied largely through Portuguese Iberian connections with South America.
Yes, this is something that should be emphasised again and again, that the East India Company, when they were beginning to try to open up larger trade, they had nothing to trade with because the Indians wanted nothing that the British could bring. It took quite a long time to invent these trade routes and triangular trades with opium and tea and so forth. It took a long time. Until then, the Europeans had to turn up with cash. And that was considered at the time as an economic theory, perhaps I can get confirmation here. Simply spending out solid bullion was considered to be a national disaster. So they were always trying to get a way around it, but they never did.
There's a wonderful pamphlet which was published just as Roe was setting off on his voyage, which is an absolutely ruthless critique of what the East India Company and most of the other trading companies were doing. And this is the other thing, that we think about the East India Company in isolation, but actually the merchants who funded the East India Company had their fingers in many pies. So Thomas Smythe, the man with the carriage I mentioned earlier, was involved with both the East India Company and the Virginia Company, which was going to North America. So was Thomas Roe himself. He had cut his teeth on a South American voyage. That was his credentials. But this particular pamphlet wonderfully talks about how England is decimating its forests to make these great ships, decimating its towns to feed the great ships with people to run them, and decimating its state by spending its silver on these foreign trifles of various kinds.
Right, can we broaden something? It's something I found in your book, which I found really, really interesting. I've read a lot about Mughal governance. I tried very hard to understand Mughal governance because I don't think you can understand the rise of the East India Company and the eventual British takeover India unless you understand how the Mughals ran the country and how the social system and the land tax worked and so forth and so forth. Because India was almost conquered because of the land tax. It was a profitable place to conquer, not particularly to trade with, but it became very profitable to rule because of the traditional land tax system. So I've spent quite a lot of time reading about the Mughal governance. But I'd never heard this thing which you brought up, that you could have blood brothers, but you could also have milk brothers. And this actually brings in the role of women into politics in a way I had never seen written before. Can you tell us about milk brothers?
Well, partly when I started writing about Roe's engagement with the Mughal court, I really wanted to look at the other perspective as well. And once you start looking at the perspective of the Mughals and juxtapose that with Roe's own diary, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why we have such a full picture of the embassy, because Roe wrote a day-to-day journal, which becomes one of the things that I keep going back to. And on the flip side, the Mughal Emperor Jahangir wrote the Jahangirnama, which is also, to some extent, a day-to-day journal. So you have that wonderful, rare moment where you can pick a day, any given day in an embassy, open these two documents, and see exactly the same event from two different perspectives.
But Jahangir didn't actually mention Roe.
He does not mention Roe at all.
He's so unimportant to him that he doesn't actually devote time to talk about him, does he?
But looking at Jahangir also, opens up this perspective onto the interior world of the Mughal court, and that's what particularly fascinated me. Roe is aware, perhaps obliquely and distantly, that the women in the harem play a major role in Mughal politics. For him, and to a large extent he is one of the originators of this perception, that becomes a sign of the failure of patriarchal statecraft within the Mughal court. He says that this is because Jahangir is weak, the women hold sway great sway. And this is partly coming from his own Stuart anxiety about James I and James's very fraught relationship with his own queen, Anna of Denmark, and her coterie, of course. But once I started looking into that perspective, I paid increasingly more attention to what the women were doing and the women's role in implicitly controlling and influencing Mughal statecraft, Mughal politics. And that's where the Milk Brothers and the Blood Brothers come in. Of course, we talk about the complex familial connections within the Mughal dynasty itself, the multiple wives and the sons, the cousins and brothers and sisters, all of those family dynamics. But as in England, the Mughal courtly women would not usually feed their own children. The children would be taken over by a milk mother. And there were two reasons for that. One was social, of course. The breastfeeding of the child is seen as something that is immensely nurturing, but it's also a way of absorbing other powerful families into your coterie. It's also a way of ensuring that the child in question has a separate network that it can fall back on, that he or she can fall back on, particularly him. So in the case of Jahangir himself, his milk mother and her sons become a part of his own network of confidants. And that's the same thing that happens with Prince Khurram, who later becomes Shah Jahan. Those coteries make that political governance structure far more complex in multiple ways, I think.
Yeah, but they also believe that the milk actually transmits qualities, don't they? That if the milk mother's qualities, the blood mother's qualities, or blood father's qualities go through the blood, but the milk itself is a bond and it bestows something on the child, isn't
Absolutely.
that right?
And
which I think is extraordinary idea.
In a way, that's a wonderful moment where you see the interaction between European and Asian thinking through a shared history of Arabic medical sciences. That same idea of milk carrying qualities with it is there hard-coded into Galenic medicine in early modern England in the same period. So there are long kind of directives when courtly women kind of send out their children to be fed. But there are long kind of directives in treatises which talk about finding a suitable person as the nanny, essentially, in those cases. But in this case, it is particularly important when the person you're dealing with may well become the future sovereign. So all those medical theories about the properties of the mother's milk and how that instills particular virtues or character in the baby become especially important when you're talking about someone who might, in fact, control the destiny of the family, the imperial family in the future.
Thank you. Are we getting near a time we could ask for questions from the audience? Do you have anything more you'd like to say? Oh, I'm sure you do, but can we...
Yes, you don't want to give me that open-ended invitation.
I'd be delighted.
So soon before lunch.
It's fascinating listening to you, and it's a very readable book. And it's one of the, I would just say as a sort of little appendix, it's a very good example when you're seeing the courtly politics of James I, who is a headstrong and difficult person, and of course his personal relationships determine the nature of the politics of his court. And you get exactly the same thing in India, where you have courtly politics, where the personality of the people at the centre and their interfamilial relationships absolutely determine the politics of the country. Not what you might call government policy, but the nature of the politics is determined by a courtly system in both countries. Now, by the time the British are taking over India, the British have no longer got courtly politics. I think that's actually quite an important political step that comes. For myself, I just say I do cover that idea in my own book, which is available on a good internet near you. There it is, Peace, Poverty and Betrayal. I trace the sort of parallels between Indian politics and British politics, which I think is one of the virtues of the book, because that's not often done by people. They tend to talk about India without taking into account what's going on in Britain. And I particularly like that in Courting India, that you brought those two absolutely parallel together.
Well, before we open up for questions, since we were talking about courtly politics and women particularly, shall I read a little bit from one particular bit of the book, which talks about that? And that might give you a sneak peek into it. I don't have a hard copy of my book with me because it was heavy. But I will read you a bit which comes from a chapter called Hidden Figures. And this is about halfway through in Rose's embassy. He's been there for about a year. He thinks he's making some sort of headway when suddenly everything stops for him and he doesn't know quite what has happened. This, by the way, is after the Nowruz celebrations where he presents the emerald to the emperor. The signs of Nowruz celebrations had long disappeared from Ajmer fort. For weeks, the magnificent tent city of visiting dignitaries had filled the space between the palace in the center and the imposing outer wall, spilling out into the city beyond the gates of the fort. Bustling attendants had packed up those tents, and now that place was empty. Courtyards that had been covered with richly decorated velvet and cloth of gold shamianas had been opened up once again. The endless stream of festivities had stopped. In the high summer heat, the palace would have seemed quiet, almost unnaturally so. There is a silence in Jahangir's memoirs too. On this date, an event took place of which, no matter how much I wanted to, my hand and heart would not let me write, he notes. I had to tell Itimaduddaulah to write it for me. The date was 5th of June, 1616, the 29th day of the Islamic lunar month of Jamada al-Awwal, the rainless month. And a little 3-year-old girl had died. Her name was Hurul-Nisa, and she was Jahangir's beloved granddaughter, the firstborn child of Khurram and Arjamand Bano Begum, the future Queen Mumtaz Mahal. The chronicle of Khurram's own reign, the Shah Jahan Nama, suggests that her birth in March 1613 had so delighted her grandfather that he adopted her as his own daughter. If so, Hurul-Nisa had spent most of her brief life toddling around the inner colonnades of the palace at Ajmer, where Jahangir retired most afternoons after the daily public darbar. Smallpox had taken her quickly after the end of the Nowruz festivities. She had been feverish on the 21st of May. Within 15 days, she was dead. When Roe was a young Inns of Court man in London in the 1590s, keen on theatre and poetry, a playwright who had just lost his own 11-year-old son had put on stage the dark comfort that grief could bring. For Constance, a mother grieving for her son in Shakespeare's King John, loss filled a vacuum that was 100-fold worse. Grief fills the room up of my absent child, she says, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief? For Jahangir, though, the sight of Hurul-Nisa's empty room was unbearable. He ordered it to be walled up, but could not stay in the palace. Along the way, no matter how much he desired to control himself, involuntary tears poured from his blessed eyes, Itimaduddaulah wrote. And for a long time, at the mere mention of a word that reminded him of her, he broke down. I talk about how the grief about the death of children was nothing unusual in Rowe's own court. In fact, one of his closest friends, the playwright Ben Jonson, writes 2 poems roughly around almost exactly at the same time about the death of one of his sons and his daughter. But for Rowe, most of that surge of grief in Ajmer that summer passed him by. Just as the presence of the English ambassador does not get even a mention in Jahangir's memoirs, little Hurral Nissa's death gets only a passing reference in Rowe's journal. "The prince's child died," he writes, "whereat the king took great grief, so that he came not abroad, neither the prince nor any other great man. So no business could be proceeded in." He recorded on the 5th of June. Rowe was caught up in his conflict with Khurram at this point and preoccupied with the tension surrounding his exclusion from court. Mughal slowness to redress English grievances frustrated him, and he was worried about his own future as well as that of English trade. Yet, in as much as negotiation depends on grasping the human elements at work, he was constrained by his lack of understanding of the hidden figures and relationships of whose existence itself he was, at best, only partially aware. What he assumed to be a delay driven by Mughal willfulness was circumscribed by lives and emotions unfolding behind doors through which he had no access. Thank you.
Do we have a question? A question anywhere? Yeah. Gentleman there, Zario. Hello.
Zario Masani. I am not an economic historian, but may I inject a note of social realism into this discussion? Because the economic historians whom I read, ranging from Angus Maddison down to our own wonderful Tirthankar Roy, would argue that the per capita wealth of India was less than half that of the UK's in 1600 at the peak of the Mughal Empire, and declined thereon down to the 1700s. So the condition of the common people under the Mansabdari system, which was hugely exploitative, didn't allow for agricultural surplus to be invested in technology. And a century later, you have Francois Bernier from the court of Louis XIV becoming court physician to Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, and writing back to Louis XIV that you will be appalled by the condition of the common people and the countervailing luxury of the court, which far exceeds that of Versailles. So I just raise this as something which you cover in the book.
I think the key there is in the phrase that you used, a century later, and that's quite crucial. There's a temptation, I think, to telescope a couple of centuries of history when we are talking about this earlier period. And of course, what happens after 1618 are 2 major famines in India as well. By the time when Bernier comes, French economy has also benefited greatly from their North American establishment of colonies. So there's a big change that has happened in both of those geopolitical areas. Thank you.
A per capita income.
Sorry?
Per capita GDP was less than half that of Britain's in 1600, despite the wealth, or countervailing wealth of the court.
Yes, you're sort of talking about, as it were, sort of discretionary spending by the rulers, which was much higher in India.
Yeah, it is much higher. The other thing to note is that Britain as an entity does not exist in 1614. James I is very clearly the king of England and Scotland. He's desperately trying to create Britain as a national entity. That's not going to happen for a while. What is clear is not simply about per capita income. What drives trade in this period is the expendable income of the state. James's state and his own kind of economy does not have any expendable income. In fact, just before Roe comes to India, the 1614 Adult Parliament is named as the Adult Parliament because this is James's last desperate attempt to raise taxes in order to feed into the Royal Exchequer. The English Royal Exchequer at this point is struggling greatly. It is very, very close to bankruptcy.
I think you're sticking up for the common people of India, aren't you?
Yeah.
That's what you're
I
doing.
was.
Yeah.
Yes, that's,
Yeah.
that's why somebody, I can't remember who, said that the Taj Mahal was a teardrop on the cheek of history. And someone else said it was a monumental waste of money. I think I know who that was. Actually. That was V.S. Naipaul. Another. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
You mentioned that there were two other powers, European powers, at that time. Roe's mission was a failure, complete failure. What were those two other powers doing at that time? Weren't they also approaching the Mughal court, the Dutch and the Portuguese? I'd like to have something about what they were up to, those two powers.
Absolutely, and they caused Roe no end of headaches. The Portuguese had been there for the best part of a century in Goa, of course. And in fact, one of the really interesting things about Roe's engagement or Roe's letters back to the East India Company that I write about is how keen he is to distance English policy from what the Portuguese were doing. So he says very clearly, don't follow the Portuguese example in India. By no means should you establish permanent bases in the country. And certainly don't establish military presence in the country. There's a really interesting letter where he says very clearly, war and traffic are incompatible. In other words, war and trade are incompatible. War does not make economic sense. So there's the
quiet trade.
Absolutely. Quiet, but also agile and flexible, something that could move with the needs of the market. So that's the Portuguese side. The Dutch are a completely different matter for Roe, because there's that unfortunate moment where he's at the Mughal court. The Dutch ambassador, the first Dutch ambassador arrives, and Jahangir apparently turns to Roe and his interpreter and says, well, you say you don't trust the Portuguese because their faith is slightly different from yours, and you said that these people share a similar faith, so why don't you plead their cause? What a difficult moment for you to be in. So the Dutch are comparative newcomers, but they're gaining ground very fast. And partly this is because of the point that Roddy made earlier, about that expansive sense of the East Indies. So the Dutch already had strongholds in Indonesia and Spice Islands.
Yes, that's the main point, that the Dutch had actually had a much more success on the Spice Islands than the English, which is why the English were playing catch-up, and the English had diverted into India to try to help them in this general idea. But the Dutch were already miles ahead in what became Indonesia and Sri Lanka. They had other areas of operation. And so I dare say the Dutch weren't trying quite as hard. Would that be fair?
Well, they were to some
relate
extent.
To the Mughals.
Yes. I think what's interesting is that there's a moment where we know that Dutch-English, Anglo-Dutch tension was rising in Indonesia and the Spice Islands. There was a lot of conflict. And that's also precisely the moment where Roe, on his return voyage, his ship passes a Dutch ship carrying a Dutch general to India. And they make this, what I think is absolutely astounding agreement, an individual, personal agreement between the two of them to write to their respective employers, essentially, to try to disperse that tension. Because on an individual level, they both agree that that kind of Protestant infighting between these two groups would only advantage the Catholic Portuguese. And that would be a fate worse than anything else as far as the Protestants were concerned. So there's a really complex kind of triangulation going on there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think India is a theatre of conflict, because actually the Dutch did well in the Indonesia, and they stayed there till after the Second World War. The Portuguese were gradually pushed out of nearly all of India and Sri Lanka, except the Goa and Diu and Daman on the west coast, and they changed their focus to Brazil and South America. So actually, even during this period, you can foresee the next 250 years of what will be the colonial carve-up of the Southern Hemisphere. India is the contested one, and it ends up being contested by England and Britain and France, not by the Portuguese and the Dutch at all in any scale, because again, the intervening century, we're talking till the 18th century, creates a very, very different backdrop.
And of course, it throws a very long shadow elsewhere as well. So we were talking about the Dutch and the English in Indonesia. One of the small English strongholds that the English barely managed to hang on to for ages, a tiny little island of Ran. Later on, they swap for a little bit of landmass in North America, a little place called New Amsterdam, which they promptly kind of rechristen as New York.
We've got a couple of minutes left before lunch, so...
Francesca in the middle.
Thank you very much. That's been such an interesting conversation. I have two questions. One is, how much did Thomas Roe actually know about the court in London? I mean, how much was he, what kind of, how close was he before he left? And the other is, how does he talk about his interpreter, or did he have, how was it, how was the linguistic communication, and perhaps was he less also fortunate than the Portuguese or the Jesuits and so on?
Oh, such wonderful questions. So to answer your first one about how much Roe knew about the courtly world of the Stuart court, of James I's court, that was in fact one of the reasons why he was chosen. So he becomes a gentleman esquire of the body for Elizabeth I, and that basically means the inner circle of about 12 people who were in immediate contact with the monarch when the monarch was out and about. And then when James comes to the throne, Roe has a significant piece of luck, which is James is a monarch for the first time in ages in England with a young family. He comes with his two eldest son and daughter, Henry and Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, and Roe very quickly gets absorbed into Princess Elizabeth's household. So he's absolutely at the heart of all the courtly intrigue, all the anxiety about bribery and gambling and nepotism that was going on in the Stuart court at this time. He has people, his close friends, send him very gossipy letters, which he gets, mind you, 6 months late in most cases. But he's very well informed about that.
It's also worth mentioning, isn't it, that actually Sir Thomas Roe's family were actually very well connected in the City of London as well, the merchant community. He was a very good candidate for this particular job. He had a foot not just in the court where he was well connected, closely connected, but also in the city. Isn't
Absolutely,
that right?
Yes. He comes from, on his father's side, he comes from a family with 2 mayors of London within the immediate family tree, his grandfather and his uncle. His father is the rather unfortunate 3rd son. To go back to your second question about interpreters, one of the people, so writing this book, I very much wanted to go back to individual lives rather than think simply in the abstract about the big kind of forces that are determining interstate kind of negotiations in this period. And when you start doing that, you always get obsessed with certain figures. And one of the figures who obsessed me was Roe's personal interpreter, a man called Jadoo, or Jadoo, we don't know. I'm tempted to imagine he is called Jadoo, because wouldn't that be wonderful? He does work his own kind of magic. But it's more likely, given his Gujarati background, that he's probably a Jadoo. And you get glimpses into lives which you would otherwise not be aware of. We know about Jadu's sons. We know about his keenness to get employment for his sons. We know about how he was constantly underpaid by the East India Company. What it also illuminates is Rowe's own absolute resistance to learning any of the local languages, which causes him no end of trouble. And I am, puzzled by it, because within his own household, so the whole English contingent lived in very cramped quarters in a single house in Surat and then in Ajmer. We know within his household there were other people who were learning Persian at the same time. In fact, one of them keep a very studious vocabulary of Persian words, which you can still look at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, decorated with board doodles on the margin, as you would do if you're learning a language. But Rowe doesn't. So there are moments in his negotiation with the emperor and with the court where he desperately struggles. There's a moment where Jadu, in one of his fits of temper, has left him because he's not been paid enough. And Rowe is saddled with this Italian jeweler who just kind of muddles along. They don't have a common language either. So Rowe speaks to him in broken Spanish. The jeweler then translates it into really broken Persian. And that causes them huge amounts of misunderstanding. To some extent, I think that is a part of his preservation of his national identity, but maybe he was also terrible at languages.
Yes, there's a school of thought about Sir Thomas Rowe that he was prickly and difficult and stood on his dignity at every corner, which you can understand when you're actually a supplicant. You can understand that you don't want to be kicked around. But actually, this does seem like a personal failing, that he couldn't engage with the culture, couldn't engage with the language. That seems mad for a diplomat. It would surely be of advantage to be able to speak the language well and understand what people are saying to you properly, and be able to get across better than in broken Spanish via broken Italian or whatever. Yes, it does. That's an odd failing on his part, I think.
Well, I'm very sorry to have to bring this session to an end, especially on the low point of the English and their language learning. And maybe also, if I see our former professor of Hindi speaking here about language learning in British universities. But what a wonderful talk. I feel very inspired, and so much this reconsideration before we all get on our high horses about we ought to look the horse in the mouth first, I think. So an absolutely splendid session. It's now lunchtime. There's lunch available for everybody on the ground floor. As somebody who knows this building very well, I just like to